A common unspoken rule of Commander is that people should get to have a game plan, to do a thing, to do their thing. And on the surface, this makes a lot of sense. It's a casual format, and people are here to have fun. In other casual multiplayer games, universal participation is understood to be a core tenet, and steps are taken to ensure that all players get to play a part. In a role-playing game like D&D or Pathfinder, you don't want to let a player be a wizard only to then have them spend the entire campaign in places with some mysterious anti-magic field. That's not ideal gameplay. So, broadly, it's understandable that Commander echoes this understanding, and even allows players 100 cards worth of expression in how they play the game. This is all fine and good, but what's easy to forget is that Commander is a multiplayer offshoot of a generally two-player game, an offshoot that didn't always exist. The fact that the format has a higher life total than 60-card 1v1 formats is intentional. It works to make space for decks that would otherwise struggle. There are a lot of potential creative strategies that simply can't hold up in a 20 health format. Attacking people with creatures early is just a bit too good. In this way, Commander's 40 starting health itself serves as a built-in do-the-thing enabler, no extra effort needed from players. This higher life total was intended to accomplish a task, and it did so admirably. However, over time it has accomplished a lot more than just this. I'm getting ahead of myself though. Commander has basically grown up with this identity of being a slower format where a more laid-back form of Magic can be played. This is reflected in the mana curves of a lot of the original precons. Zany high-cost stuff is a staple feature of the format, and these sorts of cards are often core pillars of their respective decks. There are a couple frameworks we could use to think about how EDH decks compare to decks in a 60-card 20 health format. One is the turning point of a given game. Basically, if we separate each game into a build-up phase where players are preparing and a climax phase where players are starting to perform whatever action will win them the game, roughly when is there a transition? In a lot of classic 60-card decks, this turning point is quite early. Delver decks look to land a turn 1 threat and gradually chip down opponents, and other decks like Jund similarly look to land early threats. In contrast to this, most Commander decks spend the first several turns of the game ramping, setting up engines, tutoring, and starting to piece together synergy packages. A big piece of this likely comes down to life totals. 40 life means that a threat needs to be larger to pose a risk to opponents, whereas in Legacy a single mana can be spent on a deck's win plan, followed by a long sequence of turns spent purely defending that plan and suppressing a player's opponent. A much larger mana investment is necessary to break through 40 life without the help of an infinite combo. In addition, even if a deck defeats a single opponent, there are still two opponents at the table, so it's often wise to invest an even greater amount of mana up front to formulate a threat that can subdue two or more players in rapid succession. The fact that larger investments are needed to win games means that draw and ramp are almost necessities. Plans will involve lots of cards that don't directly contribute to winning a game. This is another point of contrast between Commander and 60-card 1v1 formats. In a burn deck, an ever-popular archetype in 60-card formats, a majority of a deck will often be spent on the task of reducing opposing life totals. Though you could point to control decks as spending less deck space on direct win cons, these decks still use cards like removal and draw to build up to the dominant game state they need to be in to win. A Lava Spike performs a similar role for an aggro deck as an Up the Beanstalk does for a control deck, and this comes down to the fact that different decks are different. If we focus on ramp, removal, and draw as categories of card, a large portion of decks in 60-card formats exclude one, two, or even all three of these things, which is notable when you consider that basically all Commander decks are expected to have all of these things. This is also in spite of the fact that Commander decks have access to, well, a Commander, an additional card that is available at all times, a permanent 8th card in hand. A lot of people fail to acknowledge how incredible that is. A deck could easily pick out a commander that mostly fulfills a particular role to allow their deck to focus less on that. But this isn't generally what happens. Taking a look at some popular recent commanders is mostly payoff or escalation of some kind. When a thing happens, either more of that thing or something different happens. A lot of commanders will draw cards in some form or other, but these decks will then still include a lot of card draw. These features paint a specific picture of Commander as a format. Decks are expected to run decent quantities of ramp and draw because they're expected to be bigger, taller than decks in 60-card formats, and this is facilitated by having more cards and more mana. This much is unsurprising. On some level, these attributes are encoded into the very DNA of the format. However, over time, this DNA has twisted and metastasized into an increasingly homogeneous version of the format, one where decks are expected to look a certain way. Decks have grown bigger and taller over time. They gain more mana and draw more cards than decks in the past did. The funny thing about ramp and draw is that they have an amplifying effect. While a win con or a removal spell won't generate more of those things, ramp gives mana to cast more ramp spells, and card draw finds more card draw. As more and more powerful draw engines have been printed over the last 10 years, along with EDH developing a more streamlined deck building culture, decks that focus heavily on draw and ramp have become more and more prevalent. In tandem with this, deviance from this version of Commander has become increasingly challenging from a social standpoint. When players see opponents doing some sort of tall game plan, one deck-building reaction could be to go under it. This is common in competitive 1v1 formats. You play aggro to rip away your opponent's life total while they're still in the setup phase of their greedy nonsense. You play combo to take advantage of them ignoring you. You play stacks pieces to clamp down on specific play patterns. All of this is possible in some form or other in Commander. You can play Voltron or Group Slug, you can play combo, and you can play stacks pieces. The issue is, these things are often considered rude at a lot of mid-power EDH tables. It's uncouth to see your opponent doing some greedy nonsense and to then try to cramp down on it. The polite counterplay is to go bigger, to get more mana and more cards and escalate harder. Commander as a casual format has the awkward dynamic that there isn't a metagame per se, and everything that happens is basically moderated by a giant glob of expectations that players and their opponents decide on, verbally or otherwise. While certain plays might not be explicitly disallowed, there will be varying levels of social acceptance of various different options a player could decide on. These social pressures then reinforce themselves as different players enter and exit the format under these new conditions. If a player base decides that Armageddon is unacceptable, well, Winter Orb is almost as bad, and Gaddock Teague is a bit too stacksy as well, and Archon of Emeria also constricts player agency, doesn't it? And I don't know about poison counters and commander damage either. Those seem pretty sus as well. As countermeasures become less and less widespread, players will feel more and more emboldened to chase big, greedy decks to their logical endpoint. As snowbally mid-range decks are allowed to become a more and more dominant part of the EDH landscape, they become all but synonymous with the format. They become the way to play casual Commander. Now, I don't want to necessarily say that this is inherently a purely bad thing. I have multiple decks that are absurdly tall or absurdly greedy, and I've also made decks with the explicit intent of being taller than other decks. The dominance of tall Commander means that players are able to do big, expressive plays with a wide degree of freedom. It means that new players are allowed to explore the format without getting immediately pressured down by decks built with the intent to kneecap slower and greedier decks. Any given deck's thing might take more or less time than any other deck's thing, and allowing the most of these things to happen involves pushing back the point at which decks begin to focus on closing out games, letting decks focus more on the build-up stage. If the goal is to accommodate the most of these and allow the most people to do the most of their thing, tall EDH is really the only way to go. However, it's worth keeping in mind that this form of Commander isn't without issues all of its own. One issue with the gradual upward race of tall Commander is something I spent an entire 20-minute video on a couple months ago: information overload. EDH boards are wildly complex these days. While 60-card 1v1 formats feature the relatively simple board state of 2 players, EDH features the board states of 4 players, board states that are often far more complex than ones that would be found in 60-card formats. As a result, players in a game of Commander need to process a lot more different cards than players in a 60-card format, and doing so will use mental energy that could be spent on planning turns, strategizing, politicking, or performing alternative forms of threat analysis. This will naturally fall hardest on newer players, who are familiar with fewer cards and thus need to take more time to process the cards being played in a game. Some of this added information is inherent to Commander as a format. Having 4 players is kinda baked into how we do things here in EDHville, and having a massive 30-year-long card pool is likewise a fact of life. Commander is unavoidably going to be more complicated than 60-card formats, and that's just kind of the price of entry. It was originally popularized by judges, after all. What's not a fact of life is everybody playing these big escalatory mid-range piles, with each deck developing more and more utility or value permanence over the course of a game, each with probably way too much text. Commander is inherently complex, but it doesn't need to be this complex. Big complex board states, paired with decks that want to perform exponentially more actions as the game progresses, lead to an additional problem: turn lengths. Casual EDH games have a reputation for being mercilessly long at times, and I'd argue a lion's share of this is due to long turns. Long games aren't always a bad thing. I've had multi-hour back-and-forth grinds that were genuinely exciting. However, when turn length is the primary cause of a game's length, things are rarely this enjoyable. One of the issues is that long turns beget long turns. If the game's turns are a sequence of back-to-back 5 to 10 minute fiddle fests, other people are going to start chatting or checking their phone or gazing off into space. Then, when it does get back around to somebody's turn, instead of planning ahead for it, their mind has been wandering and they need to recalibrate on what they'll be doing, increasing how long their turn takes. This cycle reminds me of some of the less pleasant D&D encounters I've partaken in, and it's a cycle that can really take a toll on the goal of maintaining a dynamic game of EDH. The issue of long turns, and thereby long games, then ends up decreasing the social acceptability of more aggressive strategies. This pattern is most clear with Voltron, an archetype that involves putting a bunch of ores or equipments on a particular creature and then defeating opponents with it one by one, but it really applies to focusing down opponents in general. Despite the fact that strategically it might be correct to fully focus down a particularly scary player, this is somewhat unpopular in part because of how long EDH games go. If knocking out a player meant them sitting around for 10 or 20 minutes for the game to finish, I doubt most people would have too big of an issue with that. However, when it means sitting around for 45 minutes or even an hour while the remaining players fiddle around with their fussy boards of snowball midrange, it's a bit less ideal. In addition to the other issues I've mentioned, the current Commander landscape is one that favors board wipes quite heavily. Players will put together these wild snowbally packages that explode out of control in a matter of turns, and when there are multiple of these sorts of decks with taboos against stacks and aggro, the only option is to board wipe, and to board wipe frequently. The collateral damage of this will be the players trying to advance their own game plan at a normal pace, trying to gradually build up something of their own. This is the paradox of doing the thing. The form of Commander that gives players the most time to develop a slower game plan is the exact same form of Commander that cultivates board wipes as this constant and unavoidable factor. You get to do the thing, and I sure hope you liked doing that thing because you're going to get to do it about 5 more times after getting board wiped repeatedly. So those are some of my problems with the state of Commander as it currently exists, this wildly tall version of the format. And a natural follow-up question might be, can those problems be solved in a way that improves the format? I mentioned the taboos against shorter strategies such as aggro and stacks, and I know some of you probably thought to yourselves, but Alex, even without taboos, aggro simply isn't a viable strategy in casual Commander. Is this true? Kind of yes, but also kind of no. It's true in the sense that if you pull out an aggro deck against 3 snowbally midrange decks, the table will likely get annoyed at you and beat you into submission. It's almost considered rude at a lot of EDH tables to introduce life total into the game as a relevant factor, before people have generated a bunch of value in whatever way their particular deck likes to do such a thing. However, the fact that games so often involve nothing but snowbally value decks isn't some kind of set-in-stone fact of life. A good counterexample to the current state of Commander is a pool of $25 decks I played with a few years back. That pool had some pretty tall decks. A Simic Toolbox midrange deck and a Gruul Big Mana deck come to mind. However, the tallness of these decks was modulated by the diversity of the rest of the pool. The pool had 4 faster decks that would put on pressure, as well as a couple control decks that could punish overextensions from any other deck. The result of this was that all slower decks needed to build in tools to hold off aggro, blockers, life gain, early removal, and so on. Likewise, all of the mid-range decks in the pool needed to include tools for maintaining a game plan through the unrelenting grasp of the pool's control decks. This little metagame resulted in well-rounded and resilient decks. When the situations a deck is likely to end up in are more specific and dramatic than simply facing a squishy blob of generic midrange, those decks need to be built in a way that adapts to that, rather than just following a formulaic plan every game. The other thing this pool did was guarantee deck diversity in games, since decks were selected randomly from a pool of 10. The average 4-pod deck pool would have 2 faster midrange decks, 1 slower midrange deck, and 1 control deck. Even in games where slower decks were represented more heavily, a singular faster deck in the pod could still usually do just fine. The slower decks were somewhat diverse, and none of them were all in on a snowbally game plan because doing this would likely lead to getting destroyed in any game with more than one fast deck. The randomization also had the side benefit of forcing players into playing all decks and experiencing all sides of things, which gave greater insight into how to play strategically. Something funny is that the Groll Big Mana deck, the greediest deck in the pool and decidedly mid-pack in terms of win rate, ended up feeling the strongest outside of the pool by a long shot. Its weakness within the pool was other decks pressuring it down, knowing it would pop off in the late game, but in the general Commander ecosystem, people play slower decks and don't have the same built-in understanding that a late game deck is one that should be attacked early and often. It's rude to throw your creatures at the snowballiest opponent turn after turn. You'd better spread out that damage. They're just trying to do their thing after all. If you want to hear more about this specific dynamic, my friend the Trinket Mage just released a video that dives into the question of whether to allow decks to do their thing, and a link to his video is in the description. Now, does any of this information provide a solution to the issues I have with tall decks? Well, not exactly, but it's a useful window into how formats get conceptualized by the people who play them. I'd encourage players to give building their own deck pool a try, as navigating a little metagame can be a lot of fun, and is a type of fun that Commander players usually miss out on. However, most Commander games will continue to feature unpredictable combinations of decks. Likewise, having decks that deviate from the snowball midrange mold can be quite fun, but generally you need to have at least 2 deviating decks in a game to really break out of the conventional mold. For my part, I'm in my aggro era. Over the summer, I revamped my Liesa Hatebears deck to have a bit less stacks and some additional tools for beatdown and value generation, and it's been a lot of fun to be threatening life totals more consistently. I'm also tinkering with a handful of other decks that can put on a healthy amount of pressure while still fitting nicely into a typical EDH game, including an updated version of the Malfagor deck from the $25 pool. Obviously, you shouldn't make it a goal to ruin the fun of other players. Some players do this, and they should stop. But I'd argue it's perfectly fine to at least push other players out of their comfort zone a bit. EDH is a game, not an art palette or a drawing cards simulator, and though the increased 40 life is nice for allowing a greater diversity of slower decks, it's also valid to treat opposing life totals the way they're treated in other formats, a thing that wins you the game if you reduce it to 0. There is no one right answer to how to navigate a social format like EDH, and people should largely be allowed to play what they want to play. We should, however, give faster and more suppressive decks at least a portion of the leeway given to the synergy blobs of the world. A more vibrant and dynamic format is a thing worth pursuing. Thanks for watching, and thank you to Architect for supporting the channel. I've been using Architect for years, and the UI is so crisp and nice looking that I've been using Architect screenshots and videos going back months, before they were even giving me money. You can check out all of my decks down at the link in the description. I also want to thank my patrons for supporting the channel. If you want to join them, you can go over to patreon.com/salubrioussnail. Finally, if you want to pick up some cards for that new stacks deck you just got inspired to build, I left a TCG Player affiliate link down in the description. I've found TCG Player to be the best place out there for buying lots of cheap cards in one fell swoop, which has been helpful for all the budget decks I've bought over the years. Alright, that's all. Bye now.